Good morning. I actually often, when I introduce these topics, I end up saying good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. But I think, given the time today and the fact that we are speaking in a session that had initially been intended for our North America regional meeting, that it's safe to say good morning and I'll say good afternoon to some Europeans who have joined us, and they're very welcome. I'm Megan O'Sullivan. I am the North America chair of the Trilateral Commission. And today I'm joined by the two deputy chairs of the North America Trilateral Commission, Jeffrey Simpson from Canada and Herminio Blanco from Mexico. So I welcome them here again in a session that we had hoped to do in our regional meeting, but we have the good fortune of still being able to pull this together and to do so with some really excellent people who can talk to us about the topic of climate change and energy. I know this is a topic that all of you, I'm sure, follow with some level of detail, but I would say that one of the potential silver linings coming out of COVID is that there is at least a much greater appreciation of the urgency around climate change. And in some respects, I think people look at the level of global and regional cooperation around COVID as a very bad dress rehearsal for what might come with climate change, which is certainly an issue that demands not only domestic attention, but regional attention and global attention if the world is to actually take actions to address the gravity of the problem that we have on hand. There's also been a wide range of reports and studies. I'd say most notably the International Energy Agency's Net Zero 2050 study that have come out in recent months. Again, really underscoring the enormity of the challenge and the urgency of action. I think we'll get an opportunity to hear from three people who are really at the forefront of this in terms of policy and research to get their sense of how close the world is to, or how close the countries of North America are to getting to sufficient action to address the problem. But that is for the conversation for the next hour. So what I'd like to address, I'd like to start off with is just by introducing three people that I'm really, again, pleased to welcome to the trilateral stage. I'm going to ask them a couple of opening questions to get a perspective from North America across the three countries. We'll have a little conversation, but I'm very much hoping that we can have an active discussion among our members who are here today, noting, of course, that there'll be many people who will be able to view this online, which is why we're recording it. So first, I'd like to welcome Jason Fordoff, who is one of the most well-known and well-recognized energy experts in the United States. I'm also very happy to consider him a friend, and I'll say co-conspirator. We're working on a workshop together about the geopolitics of the energy transition, and hopefully a co-author in the future. Jason right now is at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and there he is the founding director of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, which is really a fantastic center that he has grown in very significant and impressive ways to address a wide range of energy and policy issues. He also was just announced maybe a couple of months ago as one of the co-founding deans of Columbia's new climate school. He has a great policy experience. Prior to going to Columbia, he worked at the National Security Council in Washington as a senior director on climate change and energy, and also worked on the White House's National Economic Council and the Council on Environmental Quality. So happy to have you here, Jason. I'd also like to introduce Lourdes Melgar, who is a Trilateral Commission member, well known to many of us, another person with really impressive background in both policy and academia. She is currently now she kind of straddles two great American universities, one being MIT and their Center for Collective Intelligence. And she's also a fellow at the Baker Institute, the Energy Studies Center there, which is part of Rice University. Lourdes she held two positions in the Mexican government around the time when the Mexican government was undertaking a dramatic reform of its energy sector. She was Undersecretary for Electricity and then later Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons. So she really was deeply involved in Mexico's efforts to reform its energy sector, and we'll hear more from her about that. And finally, I'm very happy to welcome Monica Gattinger, who again is someone who really is a widely recognized thought leader in the energy sector. Right now, she is the director of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa, also professor there in their public policy school, and the founder and chair of an organization called Positive Energy. Her work, her publications, which are wide-ranging, focus on, one of the things she is an expert on is decision-making in the context of fast-paced technological change. And of course, that is certainly the world we find ourselves in when it comes to climate change and energy. So again, hoping to have a active conversation among all panelists and participants. But Jason, let me start with you and just ask you kind of a general question to give you a platform for talking about climate in the United States. Obviously, President Biden came in with climate change being one of his highest priorities in the domestic realm, as well as in the international realm. During his campaign, he had 4 priorities, and climate change was one of those priorities. And it really, I would say, has topped his international agenda as well as his domestic, as I said. So could you give us a sense of how you see the Biden administration approach and what progress the United States is making towards these newly committed emissions target, and where do you see the potential challenges or weaknesses to the current approach?
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan, for the kind introduction and the invitation to be with such a distinguished group. I'm looking forward to the conversation in particular, so I'll keep my comments brief. When Megan reached out to ask if I would participate in this, my reply, I think, was, if Megan asks me to do something, I say yes. And that's just because she's been such a tremendous friend and colleague and collaborator for so long, and knows, has forgotten more about energy and geopolitics than I think I'll ever know. So it's just great to have the chance to be with you here today and to work with you now and in the past and in the future. And to see so many friends on this call, Lourdes on the panel, people we've interacted with and collaborated really closely here at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy with. I see Yaron, who chairs one of our key roundtables, and our newest member of our research team, RJ Johnson, I see as well, which is great. So let me make a couple of comments about your question, which is what's happening in the US when it comes to climate and energy policy and what trajectory that puts us on relative to the global climate goals the world is talking about. I think there are 3 broad points to make. One is about, let me talk about the outlook for climate policy here in the US. I also want to talk, because it's a lot of what I think about, write about, and worked on at the National Security Council, about what Biden is doing through tools of foreign policy and international economics to deal with the 85% of emissions that come from outside the United States. And then there's also, I think, an important conversation to have about cooperation in North America. Maybe we'll come back to that in the Q&A. At home, I think people know the Biden administration. It is quite remarkable, even for having served in the Obama White House, and as important a priority as climate change was for President Obama, and it was a very important priority. Even that is kind of put on steroids, I think, in the Biden administration. And to see when he came into office, listed four top priorities that this administration would focus on: economic recovery, racial justice, the pandemic, and climate change. And I think that has been evident in how they have pushed on a climate change agenda, and also woven climate change in what they call a whole of government approach into almost every aspect of the federal government, domestic and international. The US has committed to an NDC, a 2030 emission reduction target of, by 2030, of 50 to 52% decline in emissions relative to 2005. That is, I would say, very ambitious. The policy agenda being pursued, I think, is important to understand, because it has shifted from even what you might have expected, 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. the major focus in Washington now, as you know, reading the papers every day, is about the infrastructure bill working its way through Congress. There's a component of it that may have bipartisan support and that has some important elements of climate change in it. We can't get much bipartisan agreement these days in Washington, but you can get bipartisan agreement for innovation, competitiveness, leading in what hopefully will be new emerging clean energy technologies of the future. And so when we talk about putting money to work for R&D, for demonstration deployment, particularly for casting a wide net of technologies that include things that decarbonize the fossil fuel industry, like carbon capture, carbon removal, hydrogen, advanced nuclear, you do get bipartisan support for that. And that is what you find in the bipartisan bill, along with some important work on transmission infrastructure. Then there's a much larger, hundreds of billions of dollars at least, for clean energy in the bill that Democrats are trying to see if they can move forward, probably without Republican support, through the complex process of budget reconciliation we can go into the weeds on, but it's basically about spending, revenue and spending matters. And the big focus there is putting lots of money to work to deploy and scale clean energy in the next decade. So I think of innovation spending as driving down the cost of technologies we might be able to hopefully deploy, a decade plus from now, like decarbonizing steel and cement and aviation and all these harder things to do. But we know how to do some things pretty well today, and we should get at it, which is putting a lot of renewables into the grid, putting more electric vehicles on the road. And that's the bulk of what you find in the infrastructure bill. Huge amounts of government investment for solar, for wind, for retention of existing nuclear power, so we don't dig the zero carbon hole deeper by retiring our nuclear fleet, subsidies for electric vehicle purchases and charging infrastructure, decarbonizing buildings, a very strong connection between the things that we can do to move faster toward decarbonization. And also, you've heard Biden say again and again, something like, when I think climate, I think jobs. So a very strong connection between things that will put steel in the ground, put people to work, and try to link economic recovery to climate action. There is also a clean electricity standard, and that has tried to be designed in a way that would be compliant with budget reconciliation, which may or may not be possible. But if it were to pass, that would be a very significant policy that would set a binding target that the utilities have to achieve 80% clean electricity by 2030, or else pay a penalty and get kind of rewarded if they do. You also saw in the framework that came out just recently talk of carbon border tariffs in the US, a little bit unexpected for some. Obviously, that's been a major focus in the European Union, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but there is discussion now of putting that into US policy, ostensibly to try to level the playing field. We can come back to how you think about leveling the playing field when your policy instrument of choice at home is not a carbon price, but is putting a lot of taxpayer dollars to work to lower the price of clean electricity, whether it would be WTO compliant, to then say you're trying to make sure your aluminum producers are not disadvantaged because you're putting a carbon tariff on aluminum imports. It's more complicated, I think, although not impossible, but more complicated if you're not pursuing a transparent carbon price as your policy instrument. And I think that's just one point to highlight in terms of what has shifted. It was only 5 or so years ago that the centerpiece of Bernie Sanders' campaign for president, very strong on climate, was a carbon tax. And a carbon tax is now on both sides of the aisle sort of fallen into disfavor as a sort of, incrementalist corporate scheme that a lot of energy companies are behind, is not up to the scale of the challenge, but there really is not. I don't think it's impossible to imagine a scenario where a carbon tax reemerges in the US, but that's not the policy focus today, in contrast to the European Union or to Canada. And I think we can talk about what that might mean moving forward. I think a takeaway from this is when you put all of those things together, what I just talked about, they can get you, in an ideal world, a meaningful way toward 50% by 2030, but probably not all the way there. And so we will continue to need to do additional work, including with, I think, congressional legislation in order to get that level of decarbonization. That's what's happening at home. In the international front, of course, it is wonderful and I think remarkable to see someone of the stature of Secretary Kerry taking a role as the presidential envoy for climate, traveling the world, trying to get other countries to elevate ambition. And I think beyond that, beyond what I think of as climate diplomacy, lead up to Glasgow, get countries to elevate ambition, work together, there's a range of other efforts around clean energy diplomacy. Again, utilizing all aspects of the federal government, international finance at the Treasury Department, the Development Finance Corporation, to help accelerate the pace of actual investment in clean energy in emerging markets and developing economies, international trade, multilateral assistance, technical assistance to help countries figure out how to achieve these goals. I worry a lot, and we can talk about it, about what I see as a growing gap with countries and companies between ambition and reality. There are a lot of pledges. There's about 70% of the world's emissions today are covered by pledges to get to net zero by mid-century. About 20% of the world's emissions are covered by binding policies to get to net zero by mid-century. So it's great to get countries to elevate ambition, then we actually have to help countries figure out how to achieve that ambition. And that does require and can be helped, I think, by tools of international economics and foreign policy around technical assistance, diplomatic assistance, and foreign policy engagement. And that's really important because between now and the end of the century, 95% of greenhouse gas emissions growth will come from outside the United States. So what does it take to unlock significant amounts of capital into clean energy around the world? There's a lot of discussion about whether the developed economies will live up to their commitment to put $100 billion a year to work helping developing economies, and that would be an important step, I think. But it is a rounding error compared to what the IEA has just told us is needed to get to net zero by 2050, which is $3 trillion a year of investment in clean energy infrastructure around the world. So what is it? That's not all going to be government. That's probably mostly going to be private capital. And what does it look like to unlock that capital through technology advances and policy to drive more of that into emerging economies and developing economies, I think in particular. We'll come back, I hope, in the conversation to how the US and Mexico and Canada can work together on that, because it is such an integrated market, a very significant market for exports of, say, cars and an integrated electricity market. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for cooperation there. Turn it back to you, Megan, thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. That's really an excellent and very clear way of helping us understand where the United States stands on a very complex issue. We'll definitely come back to some of those questions you raised, which I think are the key ones. For the moment, let me turn to Lourdes. And Lourdes, to ask you a question that allows you or opens the door for you to talk about Mexico's politics as well as its policy. How has the AMLO administration, redefined energy policy? There's been quite a significant shift from the days when you were plotting out the energy reform. And what has this meant for climate policy, given that Mexico is one of the, I would say, probably few countries in the world that seems to be going from emphasis on renewable energy and clean energy back to an emphasis or a reliance on fossil fuels. So if you could comment on that and give us a little bit a lay of the landscape in Mexico.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you so much, Megan, for inviting me to join Jason and Monica in this very interesting conversation today, very timely. And I have to say, as I was listening to Jason, I could only feel a lot of envy. Because we can look at climate and energy policy as a snapshot or as a process that does not necessarily evolve in a linear way, where there are leaps forwards and setbacks, often subject to political changes. And this is definitely the case in Mexico. Today, Mexico is an outlier in North America in terms of its commitments to climate change mitigation and the acceleration of the energy transition. The updated national determined contribution mark a retreat from Mexico's previous leadership in climate and energy policy. And I think it's important to understand where Mexico was coming from and where we are heading. Just to mention, I think it's an important fact that in 2016, Mexico was praised for being the first major emerging economy to submit its intended national determined contributions to the UN. And at the time, the Obama White House said that Mexico was setting an example for the rest of the world by submitting an INDC that is timely, clear, ambitious, and supported by robust unconditional policy commitments. So that's where we were. And let me tell you what these commitments were. Basically, Mexico committed to an unconditional reduction of 22% of its greenhouse gas emissions and 51% in black carbon emissions by 2030, taking as base business as usual of 2013. And also it committed to a conditional reduction of 36% of greenhouse gas emissions and 70% of black carbon emissions by 2030. As you all know, conditional reductions were set in terms of getting financial, technological support to move forward in this direction. And I think one of the issues that was important at the time is that Mexico was not only committed in words, but it was actually taking steps to be able to comply with its climate commitments. Not only did it start building a strong legal and institutional arrangement for climate policy with a climate change policy law that we issued in 2012. So Mexico was the second country to have a climate change law after the UK. But it also did a very important work of aligning its energy policy to its climate policy and making sure that we could comply with our climate commitments by making specific pledges in terms of clean energy levels that we had to achieve, and also in terms of mitigating methane emissions. So as you mentioned, we had a constitutional reform in 2013, which introduced sustainability at the constitutional level. And it's important to emphasize that Mexico meant sustainability here, not only financially or in the environmental sense, but also social sustainability. And this became sort of the rule of the game for projects in the energy sector. And we had also an energy transition law where clean energy targets were established. So we aim at reaching 35% of clean energy generation in the power sector by 2024, 43% by 2030, and 50% by 2050. So part of the whole issue to make words a reality was creating a competitive electricity market where we established clean energy certificates. We had auctions for promoting the deployment of renewable energies. And we really aim at increasing the energy mix, reducing the emissions by substituting oil and coal from the electricity mix by natural gas. So this is also important in terms of when we think about North America, because Mexico developed a whole set of pipelines to be able to import natural gas from the US, particularly from Texas. And this means that Mexico was able to supply its electricity sector with cheap natural gas and reduce its emissions just by the fact that, you know, natural gas has half the emissions that fuel oil. And we also established a carbon tax. So the whole sort of like regulatory arrangement was in place to be able to move forward in terms of reducing our emissions, particularly in the energy sector. We had a very notable growth in terms of renewables from 2014, when we began the implementation of the reform, to 2020, with an increase to the point that today we have 7% of the electricity generation is produced by wind, and 7.5% of the electricity is produced by solar. So basically, Mexico had recognized that a low carbon growth was the path of the future. And our emissions were set to peak by 2026. But this was then, and the reality is that now we have a very deep change, because we have seen a tremendous backlash under the López Obrador administration. Basically, climate and energy policy are under assault. And we have to understand this. In order to understand what is happening in Mexico, we really need to look at what the narrative of the president is. And we really have a populist narrative based on resource nationalism, where oil, not even gas, not even natural gas, but oil is supposed to be the motor of economic development. The sovereignty of the nation is around that. There is, again, a denial of science, or the definition of a national science. There are other data and other facts, a clear rejection of private investment in the energy sector, and a distrust of international cooperation in climate and in energy. So this means that over the past 3 years, what we have seen, and particularly under COVID, we have seen a lot of efforts to undermine energy policy. So the first thing we saw in the oil sector is that the main project that the president has, his landmark project, is building a new refinery. So they're building a new refinery on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, having brought down mangle. So there is a lot of environmental impact to this. And of course, I mean, it doesn't make sense that as the world is moving to electric vehicles, Mexico is moving to refine, to build a refinery. Then part of the big problem that we have in the energy sector is that because Pemex is set at the center of policy, of development, all energy policy is geared to what it is that Pemex needs. And this means that because Pemex is inefficient in its refining process, it produces, for each barrel that it refines, 30% of the barrel is fuel oil, that CFE plants, that is the national utility, has to burn fuel oil. This has meant that the government has issued a new electricity law that undermines the competitive electricity market. So not only have they basically watered down the clean energy certificates, they have stopped the auctions, but now plants that were due to be decommissioned because they were old and inefficient are again burning fuel oil, increasing Mexico's emissions. So Mexico's emissions are set to increase, CO2 emissions are set to increase at least 20%, and its sulfur dioxide by at least 150%. This is something that makes absolute no sense when we look at the fact that renewable energies are by far 3 times cheaper in terms of cost than the electricity that is produced with fossil fuels by CFE. And in addition to the fact that we are increasing our emissions. Moreover, Mexico, of course, is highly vulnerable to climate change. But in addition to that, we are a very blessed country because we have an incredible potential for developing renewable energies, not only wind and solar, also geothermal, hydro, eventually wave-generated electricity. But the issue is that Mexico has not really tapped that potential to its fullest. And just to give you an example, Mexico has a territory that is 5.5 times greater than Germany and has a radiation that is 5 times greater than Germany in terms of solar energy. But Germany produces 44 times more solar energy than we do. So what has been what is the main issue? Well, the main issue is that Mexico will not be complying with its climate commitments. Mexico will be increasing its emissions, but also Mexico is creating a condition in which we will not be competitive in terms of the energy that we need to boost the development of the country, but also the development of North America. I mean, we are actually affecting, or we will be affecting the competitiveness of North America, just as the world is getting ready to come out of the COVID crisis. Moreover, if Mexico continues on this path where we are actually increasing our emissions and basing our energy sources on fossil fuels, Mexico will be losing great opportunities for the development of a supply chain in the renewable sectors, just as the United States is thinking of, bringing in all the plants that, supply plants from Asia to North America. So this is a really serious issue that I think will affect the future of Mexico unless we are able to find a way to convince the administration that we need to get back on track in terms of climate change mitigation and accelerating the energy transition.
Thank you, Lourdes. That is a grim assessment as I expected it might be. It'll be interesting to come back to Jason after we hear from Monica and ask, this very question about, is the Biden administration trying to affect the calculation of Mexico, and how might it do that? But first, let me round out the picture by going to Monica and asking her to give us a similar overview of what's happening in Canada. There, of course, the situation is very different, where you have a government where a lot of the climate policy is made at the provincial level, as I understand it. And so we've seen Prime Minister Trudeau really trying to balance all these very different interests that the provinces have. But I would note, and Canada is not unique in this, but Canada has repeatedly missed its international climate targets: Rio, Kyoto, Copenhagen. And could you talk to us a little bit about Paris and beyond, and give us a sense where Canada is going on this issue?
Happy to, Megan, and thank you so much for the opportunity. It's such a pleasure to be re-engaging in North America. Again, delighted to be here. So I guess, if you were to put to me the tough question, Megan, of whether Canada will or won't achieve its Paris targets, and, will it kind of follow its existing string of not terribly great successes in terms of achieving its international climate commitments, I think I'd answer by saying yes and no. I think the yes piece is that we finally have a more serious plan to get there. We have in Canada now a carbon tax that applies across the country, which is not necessarily well known outside of Canada, and it's a tremendous achievement. And there's far more consensus and support for climate action in Canada than there has been in years past, in both society and also in business. I guess the no piece, though, to my mind, and I'm going to be a bit harsh here, Megan, is, I think it's magical thinking to believe that we're going to meet Canada's Paris commitments. And I'm going to run through why here in a second, because essentially we'd need to cut emissions by a third in the next 8.5 years. I mean, come on, it's starting to look a bit silly. But listen, okay, the message here is that the yes piece that I mentioned is really important. Canada is making progress, and I have to say I'm more optimistic than I've ever been that Canada can bend its emissions curve downward. So if we want to start with the 2030 targets, like what is Canada committed to, and how are we doing? So Canada's Paris target is to reduce emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. So that basically means reducing them from 730 megatons in 2005 down to about 510 in 2030. And I think, the crucial piece to note here that emissions have not gone down since 2005. In fact, in 2019, the latest figures available, they were at the same level as they were in 2005, 730 megatons. Add on top of that, the government's new pledge at US President Biden's climate summit in April to reduce them to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, which equates to getting them down to about 400 to 440 megatons. Massive commitment. So what's the plan to achieve them? And I think here, this is where there's lots of good news in terms of, Canada having, I would say, the most sort of serious plan around climate that we've ever had. So in fall of 2020, the federal government released a plan called Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy. It's a plan that builds on the previous pan-Canadian framework that was put in place, collaboration, you were mentioning about provinces and territories, collaboration with the provinces and territories for a pan-Canadian framework around clean growth and climate change in 2015. And this is really the most sort of serious comprehensive plan that Canada's had. The centerpiece of the plan from 2020 is to ramp up the carbon tax from $50 per ton, which is what it will be in 2022, to $170 by 2030. So that's, a fairly substantial increase and a meaningful increase. There are many, many other elements of the plan. I'm not going to go through them all here. I'll just point to a few key elements: a clean fuel standard that will reduce the carbon intensity of liquid fuels by 13% below 2016 levels by 2030. Methane regulations. I think Jason mentioned the oil and gas sector, reducing emissions by 40 to 45% below 2012 levels by 2025. Electricity generation. This is an area that, a lot of folks outside of Canada aren't necessarily aware of. There's, a commitment to for Canada to have a 90% non-emitting electricity generation system by 2030, but we're actually starting from a very good place. So we have an electricity system right now that is over 80% non-emitting. So the government is committed to phasing out conventional coal-fired power plants as part of that. There's a lot of technology deployment that's part of this plan, CCUS strategy, hydrogen strategy. Jason mentioned advanced nuclear, so there's an SMR roadmap, and then lots of expenditures to go along with this, 10 billion or more around low carbon economy expenditures, fuels, a new net zero accelerator, and the like. And the government projects that this plan will actually enable the country to reduce emissions to 503 megatons by 2030, which is actually 8 megatons below Canada's Paris climate commitment. So I guess the big, the big question is, will it work? Well, as I mentioned at the outset, Canada's emissions are at the same level now, in essence, as they were in 2005. So the last 15 years haven't seen a decline. And many would say, Canada excels at making climate target commitments, but fails miserably at actually achieving them. So I think, the idea that Canada would somehow be able to achieve the country's Paris targets in the coming 8.5 years, when we couldn't do it in the last 15, to me seems unlikely. The idea that we would be able to come close to even, going further than that, almost cutting them in half in less than a decade, the recent pledge at US President Biden's Leaders Summit seems like magical thinking to me. Now, that said, and this is the positive piece from my perspective that really is the key takeaway, is that climate is now firmly on Ottawa's political and policy agenda. There's much greater consensus and support in society and in the business community, including in the oil and gas sector, to reduce emissions. The country's made great progress in laying the groundwork for bending the emissions curve downward. I think the carbon tax, the importance of that is underappreciated. Getting a carbon tax in a federal system is not easy. Canada has achieved that. And the country now has the most comprehensive and ambitious climate plan that it's ever had, backed up with recently passed, Jason was alluding to this, net zero accountability legislation, which requires current and future governments to report on emissions reductions performance every 5 years. So what's missing? And this is what I want to end on. Like, where are the obstacles? And I think the biggest one to me is what I've referred to as dangerous optimism. That Canada's exuberance around climate action sometimes underestimates what it actually takes in the real world to translate targets into achievements. And my aim here is not to just be needlessly critical, not at all. I think the idea is, how do we address this? And to my mind, there are at least 5 key things that need to be done. I'll just put a few on the table here and we can get into more discussion subsequently. I think one of the biggest things is that we need to take off our implementation blinders. We spend a lot of time focusing on the what of policy, but seem to have a systematic blind spot when it comes to the how of actually implementing some of these measures in the real worlds of politics, communities, federalism, regulatory systems, investor confidence, energy markets, and the like. And a lot of the government's plan focuses on technology deployment and development along with new energy infrastructure, which means, of course, that you need investor confidence, community confidence, and more. The second thing I think that would really be beneficial is to expand the focus from technological innovation to institutional innovation. Yes, we need technological innovation, but we also need to develop the decision systems that will support emissions reductions. A lot of this hinges on the regulatory system, which hasn't necessarily been built to drive emissions reductions. As just a small example, what are the regulatory frameworks that will incentivize emissions reductions when it comes to utilities? Utilities regulation is anchored in a cost of service model that has a really hard time taking emissions reductions into account in decision making, if at all. And that's going to have to change if we want to leverage utilities' capacity to reduce emissions. The third thing I'd note, and this is something that Lourdes mentioned in her remarks that I think is extremely important, is aligning climate objectives with energy objectives. Climate and energy policy and policy communities in Canada, they tend to exist in silos. So there's a lot of what I think of as needless friction and missed opportunities due to sort of energy only or climate only approaches. And I think a key example here is energy security. Climate plans need to broaden their focus from energy sources, what's the mix going to look like, to incorporate considerations around energy availability, reliability, and energy affordability. Reliable, affordable energy needs to be the sine qua non of climate policy to secure ongoing support, whether it's from the public, investors, or politicians and governments themselves. The fourth thing I'd point to is, making collaboration the cornerstone of climate plans. And this is collaboration between governments, private sector, local communities, academia, and more. This is a major weakness to my mind in Canada, and it hamstrings rapid, effective action. We rarely have the pipelines of collaboration that we need to move ideas through from conception to implementation. And then finally, we need a robust policy discussion in Canada about the role of the oil and gas sector in the country's energy and climate future. Many of our discussions to date have tended to be polarized, kind of simplistic. Oil and gas is going to continue to be part of the global energy system for years to come. And what role does Canada want to play in those markets domestically and internationally in the short and long terms? Megan, I think I'll leave it there and I'll look forward to discussion. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Monica. Lots of great ideas and questions there. I did want to do a round about cooperation, but looking at the clock and seeing that we already have several hands up, I think I'll go to questions from our group. And then if there's time, I'll circle back, but many of the topics I may still want to address could come up in our questions. Let me begin with Herminia.
There you go. On me.
You're back on mute, Herminia. There we go.
There you go. Okay. So thank you very much. Three very interesting presentations. I would like to make a couple of comments to complement the great presentation that Lourdes made. And then just a comment on the future of carbon taxation and the impact on international trade. So you asked, what can the US do so as to change the direction of Mexico? Well, is the measures that Lourdes referred to are violations of the USMCA. So we still waiting after the whole year of implementation of USMCA for something serious to happen between Mexico, Canada, and the US. Now, having said that, unfortunately, I would say that the administration, the whole administration of López Obrador will go without doing anything to fulfill our obligations. The reason is, even if the US and Canada take the courage, do the formal consultation with Mexico on the violations of the energy chapter in USMCA, for that to actually affect Mexico will take a couple of years. So basically, you really have the whole administration gone in terms of bettering what the energy policy of López Obrador is at this point in time. Now, on the good news, on the industrial part, both the big Mexican corporations and the big foreign corporations investing in Mexico do have the environmental goals very much as in industrial countries. I will say that the ESG on the big corporations in Mexico is being applied. And I've seen Mexican corporations really going benchmark on the front of energy. So those are my 2 comments.
Great. Thank you, Herminio. Those are really
And
interesting.
the question, the implementation of carbon tax is easier said than done, and the damage can be massive. If we start doing this in WTO, the damage could be massive for many countries. This is a serious stuff. This may create jobs in the US, but it will destroy jobs in many other places.
You're referring to the carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Tax adjustment, exactly.
Okay, I think what I'm going to do, if it's okay with everyone, is take the questions that we have and then return to our speakers to address any of the issues that's come up or say some final words. So Antonio, could I move to you next? Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Megan, and thank you for the great presentations. I think Jason briefly mentioned nuclear, so I wanted to get a sense about how Monica and Lourdes see this playing out in Canada and Mexico. You know, it's a clean energy. I think it doesn't get a lot of discussion these days. Secondly, on what Herminio mentioned, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the European Commission actually has 12 initiatives regarding carbon reduction. And I think they will drastically affect supply chain. So some thoughts on what can North America do as a response to what the EU is doing, because I do think it will be disruptive. And finally, very quickly, on Mexico, I think that what the US can do is more on the Mexican export side, carbon footprint of goods and services produced in Mexico, rather than getting into endless discussions regarding PEMEX and CFE. So it's not on the production side, but on the consumption side from the US. That's my only hope, and I'm as pessimistic as Lourdes. Thank you.
Okay, looking for points of optimism, but understand the realities don't always match the rhetoric. I would just say, you know, some people may ask, maybe I'm bringing in my own particular background in terms of thinking that the United States should be able to change the inner workings of other governments. But I would say, going back to Jason's comments, this is one of the explicit objectives of the Biden administration, is to use all of the levers of American foreign policy to encourage other countries to move forward in their energy transition. So this is an explicit objective. And I think Mexico is a great case in point, because obviously Mexico is a country with which the United States has many different policy objectives. And how is climate change going to rank against other objectives, immigration being, you know, perhaps the most obvious one. But I'm sure Jason and others can comment on that. But let me go to someone very well known to these energy conversations, Jeroen van der Veer. Please, over to you. Looking forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. First of all, great presentations. I start with Jason. Now, we all know here that we highly appreciate all the emphasis and energy emphasis and efforts that Colombia is doing on climate change and energy policies. What my question is to Jason, and it was already mentioned by the previous persons as well, this carbon tax. If EU starts with a carbon border tax, and if the US starts with a carbon border tax, this was not the idea of the WTO so many years ago, and it will be quite messy. I think those border taxes will never be fair. So I still, and this may be a romantic hope, that early on there may be a kind of understanding that between US or North America, so including Canada and Mexico, we can come to an agreement that we don't have carbon border taxes between those two parts of the world, of that kind of thing, because I think it will hamper economy. As somebody said, it will affect supply chains, and I'm afraid in a negative way. Now that is question 1A to Jason. Question 1B is, apart from this carbon border tax, how do you look from the US at this huge climate initiative? This is 55% reduction idea in 2030. So how do you look at the other elements? And then my question is to Monica, is that Canada, if you think about Alberta, you have those oil sands or tar sands, which is very important for the economy of the province. But they are high in CO2 and the unit cost is quite high. So you can't afford a lot of CCS there. So because then it is simply too expensive. So how do you look at the future of oil sands in the context you described in the energy policies? And I simply thank Lourdes for a very interesting presentation. Back to you, Megan.
Great, thank you very much, Jeroen. I will, 3 great questions. With an eye in the clock, I'm gonna turn to Lee. There were, of course, people I was willing to cold call in my professorial capacity. I noticed people who are on the call, RJ Johnston, I know have something to say, and maybe Bo Lidegaard might be able to give us a European perspective if we have time, but Lee, let me welcome you in the conversation.
Thank you, Megan. You were looking for the Texas perspective, I can see. And of course, Lourdes, I have to sympathize with everything you say. We have a government in Texas that would agree with your government completely and is cheerfully oblivious to the implications of climate change, even though we were freezing in the dark last February. And of course, Texas feels a great affinity for the Western oil producing lands of Canada. So I enjoyed what Monica had to say very much as well. But Jason, my question is for you. This decarbonization of fossil fuels would certainly have appeal here in Texas, if anything would. How effective will that be if indeed it comes to pass?
Excellent. I think what I'd like to do is go in reverse order and ask each of our speakers to address the questions that were relayed by our participants here, but also if they have any additional comments on the implications of the countries they've spoken on for regional cooperation. It does seem that climate should ideally be an area where there's common ground. Obviously, the events in Mexico call that into question a bit, but I'd love to hear those thoughts as well. So let me begin with Monica, then go to Lourdes, and then ask Jason to wrap us up. And thanks everyone for just keeping an eye on the clock.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And thanks very much for the questions that came in around SMRs and around the oil sands. And those actually led themselves well to areas for collaboration. But I'll speak just specifically from a Canadian perspective to both of those. On the SMR front, that's actually an area where Canada has done a lot of work. We have now an SMR action plan and roadmap. And, you know, organizations like Ontario Power Generation are looking to deploy as early as 2028. So, you know, almost in time for 2030. I think there's a number of areas where SMRs can be quite useful in the country. The oil sands is one of them. You're beginning to see much greater interest coming out of Alberta in SMRs from the larger oil sands producers looking at the possibility of utilizing SMRs to reduce their emissions intensity. I think the other area where SMRs are potentially of interest to explore is looking at not just for electrification, but also for process heat. So for you know, heavy industry, the utilization of SMRs in terms of process heat for some, you know, cement manufacturing, steel, and the like. And I think the other area where they're of interest in Canada is in the north. The idea of many of our remote and northern communities, often Indigenous communities, are reliant on diesel power and shifting that to SMRs. But there's a lot of, as you might imagine, social acceptance challenges that go along with that. Very quickly on the oil sands, I think this is an extremely important question for Canada. One of the things that's not terribly well known outside of Canada and even inside of Canada in some instances is that there has been a lot of progress made on cost and carbon reduction over the course of the last 10 years. The largest producers that cover 80% of production have now aligned around a pathways initiative to 2050. I think it's a big open question discussion though, and it's a tremendous of tremendous interest to me and to others to see what kind of what kind of gains can be made. But some of the newer developments in the oil sands, and I'll end on this, are in terms of cost and carbon competitiveness lower than global and North American emission intensity. So some of those newer developments are well worth looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Lourdes, over to you.
Oh, thank you. I would like to leave on a more positive note. So I'm going to address your question about North American cooperation. And I think this is an important area where there is a lot that can be done between the three countries to advance in terms of climate mitigation. And one of them has to do with energy efficiency. And I think it's important to note that Mexico is already fully aligned to the US and Canada in terms of Energy Stars, which was something, it took a long time, but now we are, we have the same standards. And I think it's time to move on quickly on issues related to buildings, to issues related to retrofitting of buildings. We have LEED and all of that, but there is much more that can be done. Issues that are politically less sensitive to our government, such as, for instance, all the work that can be done with geothermal energy at small scale to heat buildings. And of course, all that is related to air conditioning and all of that. Of course, the big conversation on transportation, which is much needed. Mexico cannot be full part of USMCA and continue to have a successful automobile integrated industry unless we have a conversation among the three parties as other countries are moving to the electric vehicle. So I think there is a conversation there also that it could be very productive in terms of job creations and where we want to move. But I would like to leave with the last thought. And this is, it was mentioned, of course, the US is a number one, or it's a key oil producing country, as is Canada. And I think the big conversation that is pending is, what are we going to do as we accelerate the energy transition to make sure that the people who are going to be left out, the regions are going to be left out in this transition, basically being mostly the coal producing areas, the oil producing areas, are taking into account and are given opportunities to be able to have a livelihood and to be able to move forward. And I think this is an important conversation as we think of climate policy in the world, because it's not only what is happening, for instance, in Mexico in terms of the backlash that we've seen, but when we look at other countries that have strong NOCs, there are exceptions, of course, but there are other countries that are saying, we have these resources, we need to develop them. So we really need to figure out how to make sure that we can define a just transition for those countries that have these resources and that they need to find out a different path of development. I am aware that Mexico has other options, but I think this is part of the pending conversation and certainly an area of collaboration between our countries. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Monica. Jason, over to you.
Well, thanks for a great.
Not many minutes, but I know you can do it.
I think I saw 3 questions for me, and I think I have 30 seconds to respond to each, so I'll do my best. Several questions about the carbon tax and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I guess what I would say, much more to say about it, obviously we're going to have a whole session on that, we should, is it really depends what we're talking about and how it's designed. So I think in response, to your question, in an idealized world, if you had a $50 a ton carbon price that you imposed economy-wide on your domestic economy, and you said we're going to impose a $50 a ton carbon price on the carbon content of imports, and we would exempt exports in terms of from the carbon price, that makes sense and I think would be WTO compatible by leveling the playing field. I think the difficulty comes with how prone to abuse and protectionist impulses in practice a carbon tax border adjustment would be, because it's hard enough to know the carbon content of a roll of steel, nevertheless a Barbie doll or an automobile, and when you start to make these guesses, are your domestic stakeholders influencing that in a way that it leads in the protectionist direction, and that kind of stems to what Megan said. She said we're using every tool of foreign policy. I mean, we're not using everyone. And when you think about where the conversation on climate may go 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when the sense of urgency builds because we're falling short, you know, a carbon tax ideally would level the playing field. You could imagine people calling for a carbon tax to do more than that, to be in a form of economic sanction to compel other countries to change behavior. That is not how people are talking about it today. Anyway, second was the US approach. I think maybe Yaron, you asked that too. And I guess at a high level, I would say it's kind of shifted I think there's a political science, a political economy reality where more and more people are saying the politics of what economists tell us the right answer is, put a price on carbon or internalize the social cost, but that's never going to work politically. So we need to come up with another theory of change. And the theory of change now in the US, I think, is a large government investment, spur what hopefully would be a virtuous cycle of bringing down the cost of clean energy enough that market forces then, even without strong government or different government policy like regulation, would drive that. And people look at the electricity sector and what happened to decarbonize US electricity. I think that is limited in what it can achieve, right? We know about a fifth of emission reductions globally will come from negative emissions technology to get to net zero. There's no reason anyone would ever spend $1 on that unless government pays for it or requires it. There's no not much commercial opportunity there. Lastly was Lee's question on the decarbonization of fossil fuels. And I guess what I would say is it depends, what we mean by that. We will not take climate change seriously if we continue with business as usual in oil, gas, and coal and assume we can decarbonize it. But it is also the case that when the IEA says we get to net zero by 2050, in that world, we're using 25% as much oil as today and 45% as much gas as today, not zero. There still is a role for oil and petchem and for hard to abate sectors like maybe jet fuel with carbon removal. And there's a lot of gas both to balance the grid with carbon capture and being turned into blue hydrogen. So when I think of decarbonizing fossil fuels, what that means to me is what are the sources where actually applying carbon management, carbon capture, carbon utilization, carbon removal technology will make good sense to decarbonize some of these sectors that are hard, like shipping, aviation, steel, cement.
Well done. A lot of ground covered in a short amount of time. And I think that goes for the entire hour that we've had together. I leave thinking that I would have really enjoyed an hour with each of you individually, and certainly there's enough to talk about. But I think this helped provide a really important highlight or spotlight on some of the things that are happening in the continent, also some of the opportunities for collaboration, which I hope we can explore as a trilateral commission. I'd like to thank Jason and Lourdes and Monica for sharing their time and their expertise with us. And I'd like to thank all of you for making this time on a Friday in July to talk about this very serious topic. I hope that I'll see you all in October because we are planning on having an in-person regional meeting in October, and you'll hear more from Herminio, Jeffrey, and me on that topic. But until then, please have a great weekend. Thanks again to our fabulous speakers, and I look forward to seeing you all in the near future. Bye-bye.